How racism is learned, and more importantly, how it can be unlearned. Folks, racism isn't something people are born with. Babies don't come into the world hating anyone, but racism is learned early and repeatedly and systematically. And it matters because what's learned, ding, 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 can be unlearned. So, decades of research in psychology, sociology, and neuroscience point to the same conclusion. People don't become racist because they're inherently bad. They become racist because they're socialized into systems, stories, and structures that teach them to be that way. So today I want to break down how racism is learned and just as importantly, more importantly, what actually reduces it. Racial bias starts early. Children notice race earlier, far earlier actually, than most adults realize. They're watching how parents talk or don't talk about race. They absorb tone, body language, jokes, silences. And here's a key point: silence about race doesn't create neutrality. When adults avoid the topic, kids don't stop noticing differences. Yeah? They just fill in the gaps using stereotypes from other sources. And humans also naturally form group identities. We're wired to favor us over them, even if the groups are meaningless. So when race becomes tied to status, safety, belonging, bias doesn't just appear, it's reinforced. The stories we consume matter. Media, news coverage, movies, and even school textbooks shape how we understand race, especially when real world contact is limited. When certain groups are repeatedly portrayed as threats, criminals, or problems, those associations become automatic. History plays a role too, yeah? When the realities of slavery, segregation, colonization, and civil rights are minimalized or sanitized, racism doesn't disappear. It becomes easier to deny. But there's good news here. Research shows that counter stereotypical stories actually reduce bias. Representation isn't about being nice. It's about changing mental associations that shape perception and policy. Economic stress doesn't cause racism, but it activates it. When people feel threatened by job loss, inflation, or instability, they're more likely to look for someone to blame. That's where scapegoating comes in. Instead of addressing structural causes, racial minorities are framed as competitors or burdens. This pattern shows up repeatedly throughout history. The most powerful teacher of racism isn't individual fear, it's institutions, segregated schools, discriminatory housing policies, unequal criminal justice systems. These don't just reflect racism, they produce it. When systems reward some groups more than others, people often justify that inequality instead of challenging it. So, how do we interrupt this? Well, the research is clear. Yeah. First, meaningful intergroup contact. Not proximity, but real relationships with equal status and shared goals. Second, education. Learning real history, understanding systems, and examining bias reduces prejudice. Yeah. Third, counter stereotypes. Yeah. Seeing people who break stereotypes changes how our brain categorizes groups. Fourth, institutional change. When policies promote integration and equality, both individual attitudes and outcomes improve. And finally, early intervention. Teaching kids about race honestly and age appropriately prevents bias from taking root in the first place. Racism is expensive. It costs lives, opportunity, trust, social cohesion, but it's not inevitable. Yeah, people aren't born racist, they're taught. And what's taught can be untaught. Yeah. And it's why understanding racism and how racism is learned is the first step toward dismantling it. So if you want the research, the sources, and the full breakdown of this article, it'll be linked below.